Hello, hello, everybody. Wow. Oh, wow. There are a lot of you. There are a lot of people in here. Okay. Good evening. Good morning. Um, I don't know. You guys come from all over the country, so I feel like if I cover both bases, we're good. Thank you all so much for being here, and welcome to our second ever webinar. This one is about, if you couldn't guess from the music that we were playing, the go-go music we were playing. This one is about DC statehood. Thank you all again so much for being. Deborah is partying it up. I see you. I see you. It's like, okay. All right. So for those of you who were here last time, you guys know how Zoom works, how everything functions, but some people weren't. So we're going to go over that really quickly. If you look in your screen all the way to the left. You have the mute button, you click that, you come onto mute, you get muted, or you come off of mute. Later in the program, we will have a Q&A portion where you can feel free to come off of mute, ask your question, and then you'll have that answered by our special guest. Um, Next to the mute button, we have the stop and start video button. I love seeing all of your faces, but I have no power to like obligate you to stay and keep your camera on. So if you are more comfortable having your camera off, that is just fine. Moving on over just a little bit more, we have the chat button. Uh, I encourage a lot of participation in these. We had great participation last time. So if you hear something that really like resonates with you, you can feel free to type out a woohoo or something in there. The chat is also available anytime throughout the program for you to ask a question, and we will answer those questions during the Q&A portion. Thank you, Maggie, for the woohoo. And then moving all the way to the end, we have the reactions tab. In there, you have a variety of reactions. Like I mentioned earlier, something resonates with you. We encourage a lot of participation, feedback. So if you hear something you like, pick a reaction just to make sure that we are all on the same page. That first reaction there, the clapping hands, if you could just click that for me real quick so that I know we're all on the same page. See, 1, 2, 3. Whoa, so many hands showing up, and you have all been fooled. You are giving me a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, or I guess can't tell who I am, my name is Aubrey. I'm a digital organizer here with Stand Up America. I am the guy that is always posting in the organizing channel with all of the emojis, all your questions. I'm in there answering them. So now you have a face to put with the posting. Um, SUA, as you know, is just we're a grassroots organization, uh, progressive organization. We're just pushing for progressive candidates, progressive policy to get through the legislature, through our government, and just make our country, more equitable, better. Like I'm having trouble deciding on just one word to say, but we have so much work to do. We've done so much work. It's April already. Can you believe it? Um, and I'm just glad to have you guys be a part of this community with us. Without further ado, though, I'm going to hand it off to our resident expert, our special guest on DC and statehood. His name is Jamal Holtz. He hails from Ward 8 in Southeast DC, and he is a native Washingtonian. If you could all click the reaction for clapping, or whatever you're comfortable with, please welcome Mr. Jamal Holtz. Oh, I'm clapping in real life. Excuse me.
I'm getting a lot of love from Natalia. I'm loving your energy. This is an amazing group, and I'm looking forward to it. As mentioned, my name is Jamal Holtz. I'm a lead organizer with 51 for 51. I was born and raised in Ward 8 of Washington, D.C., and I graduated college from the University of Rochester. So if any of you all are out there, hello to my fellow alum. But the purpose and the meat of this conversation is really to talk about the injustice that we're seeing in our country and our democracy. Thanks, Jen, for sharing the presentation. But the more of the conversation is to talk about the real path to DC statehood and how we're going to get there. We've had a historic vote that has passed that is likely going to pass next week. Not next week, I'm sorry, in 2 weeks. But we had a historic hearing that happened a few weeks ago. And now we need to talk about what the next step is and what's going to take us to really get to that path to DC statehood. So we're going to play a quick video talking about the urgency of now and why we can't wait, because our moment is literally now. So
we're now faced with the fact, my friend. Dr. Martin Luther King once said, "We're now faced with the fact, my friend, that tomorrow is today." We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late.
As plain as it is, and as plain as you see, there is such a thing as being too late. And we can't continue to count our days without making DC the 51st state and living up to our ideals of what it means to be a democracy. And that's what that video touches on, is that residents of Washington, DC have been denied voting rights for too long, and we can't wait. So before we fully jump in, I want to give you all a bit of background on
Dr. Martin Luther King.
No, you're fine, Jen. As Jen is pulling up the slide again, I want to give you all a bit of background on the fight for DC statehood and who we are at 51 for 51. 51 for 51 is an organization that has started 2 years ago. We're reaching our anniversary coming up this May. But it's an organization that has focused on centering young people's voices on the statehood fight and Black and Brown voices on what this fight means for local Washingtonians. And what we did was we came with a fight for DC statehood. We came with a specific fight. And for us, it was that if Mitch McConnell can confirm 3 Supreme Court justices with 51 votes in the Senate and bypass the filibuster in doing so, then we believe that you should be able to do the same for democracy. So we started this organization, 51 for 51, is that we should make DC the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate, is that it should take a simple majority to pass the most pressing civil rights issue of our lifetime, and to talk about them and to pass the most important democracy piece for our country. And we went across the country talking about that. We talked to then presidential candidates and was talking to communities across the country to telling them the importance of why DC should be the 51st state, but even better, why DC should be the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. Next slide, please. So to give you all a bit of background on the 51st state, and I'm speaking that into existence, but into Washington, DC, it's a population of 700,000 American citizens, voting residents, that has a plurality of Black people, 46%. In fact, we'll be making history if DC becomes a state, that it'll be the first state in American history to have a plurality of Black residents. And that's important. If we're fighting for racial justice and civil rights, then we should live up to those ideals. DC has over 700,000 residents. We're about 712,000 now, a larger population in 2 states. Wyoming and Maine, and an overwhelmingly 86% of DC residents voted for statehood to make DC the 51st state. Again, the 50 Democratic senators represents 40 million more Americans than 50 Republican senators. So that's a lot of people. But if we truly are going to live up to what representation means and what our Constitution lays out, that there are 712,000 Americans who don't have representation. And if we want to be a more representative Senate, then we have to make those structural changes to make DC the 51st state. As I mentioned earlier, there are now bills before both chambers of Congress. There's a Senate version that has 46 supporters, co-sponsors, and there's a bill in the House that is close enough on the vote that's happening in a few weeks. So next slide, please. So to talk a bit about the injustice that exists with DC not being a state. Since 1963, DC has operated under a home rule government, which means, let me give you a bit of a historical context. In 1801, there was an act called the Organic Act that was passed, which pretty much said that DC is going to be controlled by Congress, that there's no power whatsoever for the residents of Washington, D.C., and they should be controlled by Congress. And there were some revisions that happened with that in the 1870s. But more of the story, as D.C. became more and more Black, and the residents, the power dynamics would have shifted, the more control that the federal government wanted to have on local Washingtonians. So home rule was a way of saying, here's a little bit of power we're going to give you all. We're going to let you have local government. We're going to let you elect your own leaders, but we're still going to control you. We still want to mandate and have control over everything that you do. What that means is that every time we pass a local law, as Jamal Holtz, as a local resident, if I'm advocating for a law that is important for my community, important for fellow residents and fellow people that live with amongst me, we go to our local city council, just as you all do, and to your local mayors and to your governor, and say, this is what we want to see happen in our community. And those things have to go through congressional review. So after the mayor signs the law as an executive, chief executive of this town, usually as a governor, it goes automatically implemented. It's automatically enacted. But however, in DC, what happens is we have to hand deliver those laws to the Capitol for a senator from Florida or Wyoming or Maine to say, yeah, we agree with that law now and enact it. Or as we've seen in the past, we don't like that law. DC residents don't deserve that law, so let's overturn it. And we've seen that happen, attempt to happen with DC gun laws, with restricting some of the local gun laws. We've seen that happen with women reproductive rights, and I'm gonna talk about that in the next slide, in the future slides. But we've seen it happen many times, and you see senators like Mike Lee and Nancy Mace who are persistent on saying that we're going to control local DC residents' voices and what they do in their local communities. This is my community. So someone from who we don't elect get to dictate our own laws is an injustice in its own. We saw this happening on January 6th with the National Guard, where the mayor, as any other governor, didn't have the authority to call in the local National Guard to support the Capitol Police and getting into building a perimeter and saving our democracy. The mayor has to get approval from the president. At the time, President Trump didn't affirm the National Guard. So therefore, it was hours before the National Guard was able to come out because the mayor couldn't do it herself. So we had to rely on Virginia and Maryland to calling the National Guard to support us, as what we've been doing for years, is relying on other voices and other people and communities to do things that DC residents want to do. And then lastly, I talk about budget and how those things are all funneled through Congress, and how we spend our dollars is all funneled through Congress, unlike any other city or locale. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, touched on this a bit, DC statehood is truly a multi-issue fight. So if you care about racial justice, if you care about civil rights, if you care about women's reproductive rights, if you care about racial gun control and gun violence prevention, and at its helm, if you care about democracy, then you should care about DC statehood. DC, as I mentioned before, we're literally day to day are under the life of suppression. Everything we do, everything we say, or everything we want to do locally have been tried before from congresswomen from other places that don't have a say, or who don't live here or don't represent the residents here. There's been many times where our congresswoman has introduced a motion and it has failed because she doesn't have a vote on the floor. So often it's like, as many politicians say, you're not my constituent, so you don't have my vote. And that my vote is towards my constituents. So we just want to vote in the voice in our democracy, in our Senate and in our House. As I mentioned before, like there's been handgun bans that DC have implemented that have been tried and overturned. A few years ago when there was a huge march in Washington, DC, the March for Our Lives, and DC took local matters, was one of the first locales to take local matters and to strengthen our local gun control laws. There were people like Marco Rubio that said, no, I don't want that to happen in DC. And he attempted to overturn those laws. We've seen DC be limited with budget, saying that you cannot spend local dollars on women's reproductive rights and health care. Those are all things that I hope all of us care about to support American families. We've even been shortchanged COVID relief, millions of dollars, and for a place where disproportionately the coronavirus has disproportionately affected Black and brown residents the most, African American residents the most, and in the locale where there's a majority of Black and brown residents, and you shortchange that locale because you say that they're not a state. It's at it's racism, and we have to care about racial justice to care about this DC statehood fight. So we're trying to simply we're tired of being treated like second-class citizens, and we want to see action on many of these things that many American families care about across the nation. Next slide, please. So democracy versus politics. These are some quotes from folks. These are quotes from individuals who so-called care about democracy and so-called care about American citizens. We've seen things said about DC such as DC doesn't have car dealerships, so therefore they shouldn't be a state. In fact, that's false. But I never knew that car dealerships dictate representation or dictated someone's voting rights. We've seen things said like, maybe you should go back to Maryland or Virginia and give that land back. That's not what we're asking for, and that's not what we're fighting for. Simply, no one said that to North Dakota or South Dakota when they became states. But this fight is truly, it's racist dog whistles around what this fight truly is. We've seen this happen in our country's history when New Mexico became a state and when Hawaii was becoming a state. Those populations were majority people of color, and for politicians at that time, if those two places became a state, it would have shifted majorly the representation of senators and elected officials that represented us in our democracy, and that was a huge power shift. We've seen things said like DC doesn't have real people. I'm real. You're looking at me. We're talking on the screen right now. I believe even some folks in the chat said that they are DC residents, and they're real people too. We're all real people. We're American citizens. We pay federal taxes just like everyone else. Over 30,000 people serve in our military. They fight for this country. They fight for this democracy, but in return, they don't get a democracy that fights for them. And that's a problem. So if we care about democracy, then we got to care about DC statehood. Look, the problem here is that for far too long, we've let party politics dictate the fate of our democracy, the fate of the American people. Moving forward, we have to start putting people over party. Is that there are fellow Americans that are disenfranchised from their voting rights that don't represent it in our democracy. So we can't let the politics get in the way of our democracy. So these quotes that you see, they're all false, and there's nothing unconstitutional about making DC the 51st state. These are more myth busters about, I said one of these about DC not having a car dealership, or it would be the only state without a capital city or a landfill. And it's all false. There is a landfill. There's actually a landfill in Ward 5. Most of these are quotes from people who don't even explore the real DC. The federal grounds isn't DC. It isn't where people live. It isn't where people raise their families. And we got to beat these myths by standing up for fellow Americans and saying this is wrong. This is an injustice. And as Martin Luther King once said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And again, like, yes, people really said these things. I'm gonna say one more quote. I guess the point I'm making is the electorate in Washington is very different from the electorates, and as a result, may make strange decisions. So they said that the people of Washington, D.C. would make strange decisions if we became a state. I care about women's reproductive rights. I care about affordable health care. I care about gun violence prevention. And so does many people in Washington, D.C. So the decisions that we make here locally are decisions that impact families across America. And there's nothing, again, there's nothing unconstitutional about making D.C. the 51st state. One more video, we're gonna talk from former president, still my president, Barack Obama, talking about the filibuster. And Shin's getting that up.
Let's honor him by revitalizing the law that he was willing to die for. And by the way, naming it the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is a fine tribute. But John wouldn't want us to stop there, just trying to get back to where we already were. Once we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we should keep marching to make it even better by making sure every American is automatically registered to vote, including former inmates who've earned their second chance. By adding polling places and expanding early voting and making Election Day a national holiday. So if you are somebody who's working in a factory, or you're a single mom who's got to go to her job and doesn't get time off, you can still cast your ballot by guaranteeing that every American citizen has equal representation in our government, including the American citizens who live in Washington, D.C. and in Puerto Rico. They're Americans. By ending some of the partisan gerrymandering so that all voters have the power to choose their politicians, not the other way around. And if all this takes eliminating the filibuster, another Jim Crow relic, in order to secure the God-given rights of every American, then that's what we should do.
So as President Barack Obama put it in the most simplest terms, and that's what this fight 51 for 51 is all about, is we can't let the arcane tools like the filibuster dictate our democracy and stop us from truly reaching progressive reform. We've seen the filibuster been used in the past to block true progress for America. We've seen it attempted to try to block the Civil Rights Act of 1965. It was the longest filibuster on record. We've seen it attempt to, or have actually blocked over 200 anti-lynching bills from becoming law. And truly, it's just have stopped progress that is important for our democracy and for our country and for American families. And for us, we can't let the filibuster dictate or decide whether or not DC residents, American citizens should be enfranchised to representation and voting rights. And that's what we're fighting for 51 for 51 is, again, we need you all to fight on behalf of DC residents because we can't fight for ourselves. And tools like the filibuster cannot be in the way of that. And that simply, if Mitch McConnell can do the same to confirm 3 Supreme Court justices, then you should be able to do the same for democracy and give American citizens their voting rights. So we need you to tell your senator to truly prioritize DC statehood and pass it with 51 votes in the Senate. And that's what this fight is about, making DC the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. So next slide. I know there's a lot of hands in the chat. If we can stop. Awesome. I know there's a lot of hands and questions in the chat. The first that I see here, I don't know how we want to facilitate questions and Q&A.
I'll pick them out for you,
Awesome.
Jamal. So first of all, can we just get a round of applause, like a virtual round of applause for Jamal? That was a great presentation. It's like, use your reactions, guys. Use your reactions. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. You don't have to. I mean, you should, but okay. You know, I'm sorry. I'm embarrassing myself. Okay. Anywho, yeah, so it's question time. Remember, you can use the raise hand function or post a question in the chat. There are already a few questions in the chat, so we'll be going through that and picking those out. But the first person that raised their hand was Mr. Thomas Bobbitt. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then you can go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I think the biggest problem that we have here in the United States is the Republicans are all liars, period. The most racist country in the world is the United States, and every Republican is a racist, whether he wants to be one or not. And when they talk about transparency, they think we don't know what transparency is. Because it's supposed to be that you're not trying to hide anything. But I think if you go back to the first impeachment trial where they said they was going to acquit President Trump at the time, and then they took an oath of impartiality. They lie and they lie and they lie. And anything that has to do with Black people or people of color, they are against it. And I'm here in North Carolina. And what we have going on here is that they refuse to expand Medicaid, but they are trying to repeal the physicians' supervision of practical nurses that perform as midwives and such. And they said they want to do this is to provide more medical help to the communities. Why not expand Medicaid? But again, I said it goes back to they do not respect Blacks. And what we've got to do, we've got to come together where we can help not only DC, but we've got to help all Blacks, regardless of where they are, all people of colors. And, we got Ted Cruz and that bunch. I don't know whether they think they're white or not. I know Ted Cruz's father said that President Obama should go back to Kenya. Hell, he couldn't go back to Cuba. So if you can't go home, why are you going to try and tell me where my home is? America is our home, and we have as much right as anyone else have. I yield.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Thomas.
Do we have, oh wait, so the next question comes from Lee, and Lee wrote, do both houses of Congress need to approve DC laws? Are they subject to the filibuster in the Senate?
No, Jen, correct me if I'm wrong here. It goes to the Senate, the House Governance and Rules Committee, and they approve or disapprove DC laws. And then there is a layer where it can go to the Senate for approval. But I'm not a constitutional scholar as far as, I know there's been an attempt by some senators to overturn some local laws, but I think they will have to bring it to the floor themselves. Is that right, Jen?
Yeah, and as we've seen, the senators certainly can introduce legislation to overturn it. So Rep. Nancy Mace from South Carolina, as well as Senator Mike Lee from Utah, have been introducing legislation to block childcare regulations in DC. And Senator Mike Lee has also introduced legislation to block vaccine access in DC for children or young adults 16 and up. So their senators certainly can weigh in, and their bills are also passed through normal procedure.
That's right. And Congress gets a period. There was a time, and this goes back to the budget autonomy piece. There was a time where every time the federal government shut down, DC government would as well, because of how much budget autonomy they had on DC. So, which meant people who worked in local government weren't paid for weeks in times where the federal government shut down. I see you, Deborah. I'm shaking my head too.
Alrighty. Our next questions come. Our next question comes from Julie Nye, who said, "Isn't taxation without representation unconstitutional?" And
in my book, it certainly is. And there's constitutional scholars and lawyers, actually on behalf of DC, that has filed lawsuits in courts in that matter, that there are fully paying taxes, fully American citizens who are paying taxes and don't get representation in the democracy that we aspired in our Constitution. So if you ask me, it is unconstitutional. It's against the law.
And if I remember correctly, DC pays the most tax per capita than anywhere else in the country, right?
That's correct.
Unbelievable. I have another question from Jennifer C. I'm gonna paraphrase it a little bit, but Jennifer read an op-ed in the New York Times where I guess a key worry of turning DC into a state is that it would like kind of trigger red politicians to start dividing states to get them more federal representation. So you'd end up with like East Missouri and West Missouri. Is that a real worry for this movement?
No, I mean, yes, that has happened before. Populations and states splits up to make a case to really gain some political power. But I don't see that case with this. This isn't about splitting DC up into two. Constitutionally, what we're asking for, simply I'm not asking anymore, I'm demanding, is that we shrink the federal district down to the federal enclave and everything that involves those federal buildings and monuments that people think DC is, and everything around where people live and raise their families, that's the state. The proposal, the Douglas Commonwealth, the state of the Douglas Commonwealth. And that's what we're proposing, is not to turn it into two states and not to split one state and make that DC. We're asking for the land that I'm living on right now to be the 51st state. And it's not hard. It takes simple, it shouldn't even take legislation to make DC the 51st state. But as we've seen in past precedent, is that simply that this should be enacted by a simple majority of Congress, Senate.
Okay. I mean, that was enlightening about like what the makeup of Washington, D.C. is or would be were it to become a state.
Right.
But just to clarify, I think Jennifer was asking, or the crux of the question was a reaction to DC coming to state. So not suggesting that DC be multiple states, but are you worried that if DC is made a state, as a reaction to that, would like red states decide, oh, we'll just split up our states, and then now we have a bunch of states?
Yeah, I mean, the point of this fight is not about the political grab or not about what party will have more senators represented in the Senate or not, right? Like that's not what our Constitution is about. In fact, it's unconstitutional to make points that we need more Republican senators or we need more Democratic senators. And that's not what this fight is about. But even following, that's not what any fight should be about. Like statehood for anyone, self-governance for anyone, it should not, and is unconstitutional for it to be about the politics of it all. I'm all for self-governance, and I'm all for giving people the representation that they deserve. And if people have that now, then they're getting with this Constitution laid out. But there's people in Washington, D.C. that don't have that at all. So if those movements do aspire after, then that's just unconstitutional.
Gotcha. Okay. Next question. Karen Carter would like to know, what can we do besides contacting our congressional legislators? Like, what more can we do?
Yeah, Karen, I know it's like what more, but truly for me, like calling your representative is a lot. And that's what this fight has been about. That's what DC has been about for years. And we have to stop that, is that we rely on other people's voices to advocate for us. So in addition to calling your senator, you can send emails to folks who, and call the folks who haven't signed on to the bills yet. You can encourage people from those states and those places that where individuals haven't signed on bills. If you have friends there, encourage them as well. And also to like find many ways to mobilize other people. Folks are starting up local chapters. Folks are getting their friends to email. Folks are getting their group of family members and friends to call, because what this fight is going, how we're going to achieve this fight is not just by the squeaky voices of Washington, D.C. It's about amplifying the coalition and Americans all across the country to say this is wrong. And we need senators from all across the country to hear that, to see that, whether or not if they signed on the bill or if they haven't. We need those folks to know that this is important. So if your senator did sign on the bill, still call them and say, hey, thank you for your continued commitment to DC statehood, but we need you to keep speaking out on this. But that's what this fight is going to take. It's going to take a coalition, American. It's going to take people from all across America to fight with us.
Yeah, and if I can add on just a little bit, work those networks. Everybody knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, right? So if you're a Democrat in a blue state and your senators already are down for it, like Jamal said, call and tell them thank you and like keep them close to the fire. If you're a Democrat in a red state and you're like, oh, my representatives don't listen to me,
That's
like
right.
still call them, and then you call the people that you know and have them call as well, and then you just trigger this big blue wave of calls to their office, and they're like, oh my goodness, all these people want me to talk about DC. Why? Or at like the very least, they're put on notice that you're watching, and maybe they think a little more about their decision to be like, oh no to DC. Sorry, sorry, Jamal.
No, that's spot on. I appreciate it.
All right, our next question is a good one from Nancy S. And it says, if Congress enacts a law to make DC a state and Biden signs it, what happens next? Like, how long is it going to take for everything to get up and running and for them to have representation in government? Is it a multi-year process, or does it happen right away?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, one, we can't continue to count our days of disenfranchisement, so it needs to happen now. But when it does happen, it's just as any other state when they became a state, and we'll go through implementing our own constitution as a state, and we'll hold local elections to elect the people to represent us in the Senate, the voting member in the House, a governor, and all those things those elections and all those things will happen through the Board of Elections immediately. So the day we'll become a state is the day we'll start getting the ball rolling on the elections.
Okay, so right away.
And let me just say, I answered that with what that will look like for just DC. But the day DC becomes a state it's a day where democracy has reached its potential, but it's also a day where we finally get to serve and be a voice on behalf of American families, right? Like we were sometimes 2 votes away from achieving a COVID package that supported small businesses, that supported families from getting relief, from a few votes away from a $15 minimum wage, and giving folks an opportunity to get the quality of life that they deserve. So again, like the day DC becomes a state, that's not just a game changer for Washington DC. That's a game changer for American families. We finally get to have a voice that cares about gun violence prevention and women's reproductive rights, and healthcare, quality and affordable healthcare, and all those things that we all should care about. We're missing 2 votes on all of those issues.
So close. We're so close.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So we have one more question in the chat, and then a couple of people have their hands raised because we're coming up on time pretty quickly. For people with their hands raised, I'll give you like 30 seconds to ask your question, and then Jamal will give, that way we have enough time for Jamal to give like a thorough response. But our final written question will be from Don, and he said, what about instead of making DC, oh my goodness, excuse me, everybody. Instead of making DC a state, what about making DC part of a neighboring state?
Oh.
Well, if I can answer, retrocession is literally suppression. The DC resident, we're not asking for you to suppress our voices and hand us off somewhere else. That's not what we want. What we're demanding is what DC residents asked for overwhelmingly, over 86%, is that you make DC the 51st state. No one asked. Look, we went from 13 states in the union to 50. None of those states were suppressed. Actually, some of those states were actually, let's break those down and make them their own states, right? So like we shouldn't, it'll literally be one, whitewashing to over centuries of history in DC and the culture and what we aspire here. But 2, Maryland and Virginia has spoken as well and said, make DC the 51st state. There's legislators, lawmakers in counties, and said that give them the representation that they deserve, right? Like I don't want to get too historic here, but like in history, when African Americans were considered 3/5 of a person, that was inhuman, like inhumane. The fact is, like to say that DC should join another state, that's inhumane. Like it's suppression. So we're not asking to be a part of someone else's community and their government and to silence our voices. We're asking for us to get the representation that we deserve, because just like any other fellow American or American citizen, we participate in this democracy. The least we can get the maximum in which we can get in return is representation in this democracy. Is that we pay into this government, but we don't get the opportunity to say how those funds are being used. Like, again, I'm gonna make another point on the military. Like, to tell people who serve in the military who are from DC that we aren't gonna fight on your behalf, like that's a problem in itself, right? So we're demanding that DC becomes a 51st state. Just as we added many other stars, you can add one more.
That was powerful. It's like I'm gonna walk away from this, and retrocession is repression. That's the phrase. That's the phrase I'm gonna tie to the fight for our 51st state for a while.
But I'll put it in the chat for you.
Yeah, write it down. Okay, all right, so 2 more questions, 2 live questions. Remember, you got 30 seconds to ask that question. Ready? Okay, I'm counting down like this is a race. Mr. Thomas Bobbitt, 1 more question.
You know, DC residents have been marginalized and deprived of their rights since the country was found. So it is time for them to be recognized as citizens because they pay, and representation, taxation without representation is against the Constitution. So when are we going to rectify this?
That's right. I'm with you on that, Thomas. When we can't continue to count our days of suppression and lack of representation. It needs to happen now.
And our final question is coming from Ms. Kathy Christensen.
Hey,
There
can you
you
hear
go.
me?
Now
I
we
can
can.
hear you, Kathy.
I'm sorry. My name is Kathy Christensen, and I'm from Washington State. And I just want to thank you guys for having this presentation. It's very important. And I know that my two senators, including Patty Murray, is very much in favor of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you for being here, Kathy. Oh, that's so nice. All righty.
Somebody asked, what's the definition of retrocession? Let me clarify that. It just means what was mentioned, that DC, it's when you ask DC to go to Maryland or Virginia, is to give up their land and space and give it back to Virginia and just be a part of that. That's what retrocession is as it relates to DC.
All righty, people. We got one more thing. It is action time. Action. You didn't think I was going to let you leave without taking an action, right? You guys know me too well for that. So I'm going to need everybody to pull out their phone. I know you all have a phone, or maybe, well, that's a broad assumption, but I'm going to trust that everybody has a phone. And in honor of fighting for our 51st state, you're going to text 51 to 21333. That's 51 to 21333. And sign up for a texting shift, which we will be beginning in 2 weeks on April 20th. Once you text 51 to 21333, you'll receive a link that will take you to the Mobilize page to sign up for that shift. Alrighty. All right, and I would, just to make sure that you guys did it, I'm gonna ask you to pick the thumbs up reaction when you've done it. Or just give me a thumbs up. Those are cool too. I see you, Ed. I see you, Laura. Other Laura, and Deborah, and Marilyn. We're still waiting on Carol. I see you, Carol. I see you trying. It's okay. It's fine. It's like, I see you doing it. Okay, everybody. Looks like most of us have done it. So we have reached the end. Do we have any final questions? Oh, wait, there is a final question. Hold on. Oh, it's already been answered by Joe Hines in the chat. Is there a recap that we can send to other folks? I have many friends in North Carolina, for instance. Yes, so this is actually being recorded. You can definitely share the recording once we share it out to you. Jamal, I don't know if you want to plug the website for 51 to 51 as well.
Yeah, our website is 51for51.org. And from there, you can see many ways in which you can take action. And that's also our social media channels. Drop it in the chat for you all. Yeah, but take action from there. Stay tuned with a lot of stuff that we're doing. There's a lot of new stuff that's coming up that we're launching. But really, as I mentioned, like, this is a coalition fight, and we need your help to help move us forward. So the link is in the chat.
Right. Okay. Last chance for final questions. No more final questions. Okay, well then I will say we have reached the end of our presentation today. Thank you all so much for being here. I was gonna say 51 times, but I was like, oh, people have other things to do. It's Friday. So So I'll let you all go. Thank you all so much for being here with us. Make sure that you sign up for a texting shift beginning on April 20th. That's a Tuesday. We'll be texting from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. Make sure you check out 51for51.org and stay abreast on all the new happenings going on in our soon-to-be 51st state of DC. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.